As always, we have a great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it on demand later on. Today, after the webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can before the end of the webinar. Okay, with that, we will go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Test Data on Demand Improves Agile Delivery. Our speakers today are Chris Pillay, who is CEO of Semele Data, and he is going to be joined by Don Kiernan, who is VP at Sales at Semele Data. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today. Don, I know that you were going to get things kicked off for us, so you're welcome. You're welcome. I'll go ahead and put myself on mute, let you get right to your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Charlene. Nearly every company relies on improving existing applications or developing new ones to take advantage of new market opportunities, improve efficiency, or meet regulatory requirements. And those that have a short time to market have a distinct advantage over the rest. So much so that delivering quality at speed has become an operating committee level discussion in some companies. Agile practices are all about speeding up the software delivery process to meet the increasing demands of the business. To go faster, automation is being implemented wherever and whenever possible. But there's still one element that's creating a bottleneck and slowing down delivery. As the VP of software engineering at a financial services firm recently put it, test data was and still is the bane of my and every developer's existence. Today, we're going to talk about the ability to provision test data on demand to complete the shift left and how it can bring test data into the realm of DevOps. We'll look at the business drivers, the challenges that slow down release cycles, and a new way of dealing with testing and test data to deliver quality at speed. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Pillay, CEO of Semele Data, who will be giving today's presentation. Chris?
Thanks, Don. And thank you, everybody, for attending today on this webinar to talk about a pretty important topic that's emerging across our field right now. So, as we know, the point of DevOps is to accelerate the software development and related operations to go along with it, right? To meet the expectations of the rapidly changing business environment that we all live in. But the software-related cycles have gone from, 3 months for delivery down to 3 times a day in some cases that we want to be able to release software out and use it. So, as we go through, and sorry, we'll keep up with the webinar. The top priorities for Agile development right now, and there probably have been for a while and continues to be, accelerating the delivery speed, right? So the idea is to continue to find all the bottlenecks in releasing software rapidly and get rid of them. Reducing risk in the environment, and that means, the risk of delivery, right? So that's the whole point of being able to have very short Agile sprints so we can adjust as we go. Decreasing IT costs and automating testing. And the last one is one we're going to focus in on this in this webinar. So when we think about test automation, it continues to be a high priority among a lot of companies, but it's not the only issue in testing, right? Test data provisioning is also emerging as a very high priority, and we'll talk about that today in today's webinar. So this is a slide that talks a little bit about the Capgemini World Quality Report. So we're going to give you some stats up front, just because we want to make sure that, and the people who are attending, you probably get this already, so the stats are the stats. But 53% of the respondents said that they lack appropriate test environments and data. Right, that's a big deal, right? When we're in this cycle, 56% report that there's a challenge in managing the size of the test data sets, and 61% maintain that there's maintaining test data consistency, both within complex systems and across systems, meaning the consistency of the data is extremely important in testing, as we know, and that's a challenge for a lot of people. This other slide that we threw in was around the time spent on test data management activities. And as you look at this, basically what we're saying here is that about 55% of testers are spending 30 to 60% of their time on searching, managing, and generating test data. That's a lot of time spent on dealing with the data and not having really good answers for that problem, right? So if they're spending their time managing data, they're not spending their time testing, which of course has a lot of bad effects. So let's talk about how this whole test data provisioning. So how do we provision data today, right? There's two ways that, and generally speaking, it's a continuum. So people are on one side or the other, or sometimes somewhere in between. But there's two basic methods for creating test data or having test data, right? One is to manufacture your test data, and the other is to use production data, right? Copying data from production down into a test environment. So manufacturing the data, it may be fine for like simple type systems, transaction systems, where you can just create transactions and run them. But if you get into fairly complex systems or systems are part of a large integrated environment, manufacturing data becomes a much bigger challenge, right, to be able to pull off. And it's really hard to generate the level of complexity you need from a production perspective when you're doing it manually. It's hard to generate the corner cases, the data gets stale, it's labor intensive, you know, it's typically a lot of rework, right? We were working with a healthcare exchange, and with the hospitals testing, they don't like sending over live data, so they send over manufactured data, and the data gets in, and the first time they move the application in production, it all fails, and they have to go back and redo things, right? Because now we can see the real data, and there's lots of anomalies inside of data, so it's really tough to manufacture all those anomalies. The other way that we deal with this, and if that's hard, then we say, okay, let's just go use the production data, right? So let's just copy down production, use that for testing. And there's some value to that because you do solve some of the problems that you had with manufactured data. But the problem with that one is that you have a very large volume in some cases of data from production. So as soon as you copy it down, you start this whole idea of the find the data game, we call it, right? Find the right cases of data inside this production system that I need for my test. And that could take, you know, it's pretty manual and takes a while. Obviously, using production data, depending on the industry you're in, it could contain personally identifiable information, or it could contain personal health information, right? And so we want to make sure that, you know, so there's a security risk to using production data. It takes a long time sometimes to move data from production down to a test environment, and so there's lots of bottlenecks. And here's the biggest thing that we don't think about when we use production data is that the data is constantly changing out, right? So whatever's in production at that moment is what's coming out to the test environment. And so the testers have to get used to what the data is. They have to go find all the right data they need, and that takes time. And so this idea that this data changes a lot and it's hard to stay on top of it is kind of a problem with production as well. So if we have all these problems with using manufactured data for testing or production data, which doesn't really help us in this Agile process, if we were to put together like a set of requirements, what would we want from a test data management system to work in this world? And so, so we kind of came up with a few requirements based on some working with some clients on what they would like to have here. So the idea is that while we're inside, you know, so this idea of doing test-driven development, right? So when we define a software feature, we want to define the test that goes along with the feature, and we tend to stop there. And that's not really, we didn't finish the problem. Not only do we have to define the feature and the test that goes along with it, we need to define the data that satisfies that test, because we're going to have to run it at some point, and so we need to get the data for it. So this idea is that we tie feature to test case to data for testing, right? And then the second requirement that a lot of people have is, hey, finding that data, we need to make it easy to find the data, right? Or enhance data to create the right data cases for testing. And then the third is like the testers deal with a lot is data gets stale. So if you have a requirement, a test you're running, and I need somebody who's opened an account in the last 30 days. That's the data I need for testing. They got to go out and find it and make sure that they keep up with that, because even if you had an account or a customer that met that criteria 3 months ago, it's no longer true. So you got to go find somebody else, right? That is not stale, that we can it meets our criteria. So the data, when we're managing it, we want to make sure we get fresh data that meets all the time requirements of the test. Since the data is obfuscated, right? We don't want to use, you know, live customer data, especially credit card numbers, names, addresses, social security numbers, things like that, right? So we want to make sure that data is protected. It's obfuscated, but it still looks like it's real data in our test. And then the last requirement that we really had here was that all the data for testing the application. So if I've gone through and defined all my cases and my test data along that, this whole thing should be automated, right? This idea of loading the data, finding the data, trying to run a test case, and automation that breaks constantly is not good. We want once we've done all this work for us to have really real automated test cycles, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. What we did based on all of that, we put together this process slide to talk about how this whole world should work, and we'll go into this in the next few slides and go into some detail around this. So don't try to it's not an eye test, right? But here's the thing: how did Semele get to this realization that this process needs to work this way? And it was based on some clients, and so we were working with a very large bank, and they had this whole thing. So they would copy down production data every quarter into their test environments. They were had just rolled out Agile across several development groups, and so they might be having 2 or 3 week cycles for development, and then it would take them a month to actually go find the data, and so that really didn't help much. And the reason it was taking so long is copying data is not a big deal, but they need to protect the data because they're a bank in their test environment, so they had to apply masking policies, which means that they had to rip through all the data, find all the sensitive fields, and mask them. And they had to do that for their entire production system because that's what they were bringing down to the test environment. And so when we first got in discussions with them, we had this subsetting engine that could create like a referentially intact subset of data, right? If you point at a database and say, go get me 5,000 customers, and it brings back those 5,000 customers and all the related tables and stuff with it. And so they thought, hey, if we could apply your subsetting engine to our big giant production data, that would be helpful because then we have a smaller set of data we can work with. But we wanted to know more about how they tested, and as they kind of walked through how they do testing, it became pretty obvious to us that the test was really pretty manual and was kind of kludgy in a way, and because of this idea of finding the data when they need it and trying to make sure they satisfy test cases or manufacturing data at the last second. So we propose a new way of thinking about testing, which is the one we're going to walk through with you guys today. So part of our assumption here is that you've got, you already know what the whole Agile development process looks like, being able to define sprints and features and be able to run through that and develop it, and you've got that kind of underway. And the other part of it is the operations automation, right? That you can spin up virtual machines when you need them. You can load them down with applications for testing. So we're not going to really go into those 2 lanes talking about it. There is a third lane, right, in this whole process, and it's the data, the test data lane, and that's the one we're going to be talking about. So some of the things we talk about is an assumption that you've got the other 2 working. If you don't have the other 2 working, there's clearly some work to be done. But assuming you get that working, this is how we think about the data. So let's jump into this a little bit. So there are 3 phases here when we're talking about test data management. So one is get the data for testing, and the next is manage the test data, and then the third is use the test data. So let's talk about get the test data. And so in this phase, we want this phase to actually start when we start into the software sprint. When we are defining the features for that sprint, we also want to define all the test cases that go along with the features, test-driven development, and then we want to define the data that goes along with the test case, right? So we get the sprint laid out, we got the features, and the testers, the people who are responsible for testing, go off and they build their test cases, and then we want them to go locate the test data. Well, we also want something. It was interesting looking at this at several of our clients. The testers had gotten really good at looking at like production environments and picking out accounts that met their criteria. Hey, I know that Bob Smith is always a high balance account, or I know that Joe Duffy over there tends to have overdrafts or whatever if it's a bank, or this person tends to have this kind of claim in an insurance company, and they go find those people and they try to pull those accounts in. Well, those things change over time, right? Joe Duffy got a better financial advisor and quit having overdraft charges, and the other guy decided that he was going to give a bunch of money away to charity, so no longer has high balances. So the idea is not to pin all your testing on knowing exactly who those people are, because that's kind of a problem anyway from a security perspective. The idea is to use data criteria. I need a high balance account. I need an account that's had an overdraft. I need an account that has this kind of claim against it, right? So So what we say is that specify the data criteria, allow the testing system to reach into your production environment and find data that meets that criteria and bring it back. That way, the tester doesn't have to know exactly what's in production. They can just say, go find it. And the test system goes and finds that data. And it applies obfuscation policies if you've got those defined to make sure that we don't, expose sensitive data, people's social security numbers and addresses and things like that. And then it presents the data back to the tester and says, hey, is this what you meant? Does this data meet your criteria for your test? And if the answer is no, change your criteria and go find more because you can refine that. But if it's yes, that data does meet my criteria, then the system will turn around and store it in the test data repository. So this first part of this, what's going on with get the data, is happening during the software sprint, right? So we're not waiting till after they've developed software before we go find data. We're doing it while they're actually building it. So everything is kind of moving in parallel. So this idea of shift left, that's what we're talking about. Go find data while the sprint is going on, so we're not inside the bottleneck. The second part of this thing is manage test data, right? So once we kind of get the data into the repository, it's not just as simple as storing, here's some customer accounts or customers that we're storing in a test data repository. The test data repository actually has a lot of responsibilities in this world. And so what we mean by that is, like, once we bring data to the repository, we want to tag the test data to the test case, right? So we want to, whatever the test case management system, we want to use the same identifier so we can tag all the data and say, hey, this data is used for test case number 1, it's used for test case number 5,000, whatever it is. And we also want to tag it to the system, right, that the data is for. And so when we go run, we know what data is needed to run for that test case. So we tag everything inside a repository. So when we're using data criteria to find data, it's entirely possible that we could have actually selected the same customer twice. Hey, the person could have been a high balance customer, and they could have also been an overdraft customer, right? And so we end up pulling their account for 2 different test cases at the same time. Well, if I go load that to a test environment, I'm going to get a kickback saying, hey, there's a duplicate account here. So we don't want that. So the repository's got to know enough to dedupe the data, right? When it comes into the repository, it's going to say, hey, I already have that customer, I already have that account. I'm going to go ahead and tag what I have already to 2 different cases, and we're going to go ahead and put that away so that we don't accidentally load duplicate data into a test. And then the third thing that a repository is really responsible for then too is also to keep the data fresh. So we talked about this idea that there's time-sensitive data, time-sensitive testing that goes on. I want things that meet, accounts have been open in the last 30 days. I want an account that was closed within the last week, right? Whatever it is I need for my test. So if I find data that, and I put data into the repository that shows that criteria, well, 2 months from now, that data in the repository is now stale, right? So what we want the repository to do is say, hey, here's a time-based criteria. I'm going to refresh myself. I'm going to go back into production, or I'm going to manufacture something to be able to make sure that this time-based criteria is continually met, without testers having to do all of that, right? The repository owns our responsibility and takes care of it as we go. So the repository is really the place where we manage all the test data, right? From tagging the data, deduping the data, managing time criteria around the data, all those things belong to the repository in this manage the test data phase. So let's go back again. We talked a little bit about get the data. We talked about manage the data, which is what the repository is responsible for. And now the part we have to use the data in a test, right? And so the idea is that once the test process starts, we finish our sprint, we migrate the application into a build, we run through the unit tests, and then we go to integration testing. And that's where we need the data environment to be there. So you would have had a virtual machine provision, you would have dragged in the applications that need to be there in the present, and then you send a message to the repository and say, I'm running these 5,000 cases, or I'm testing this system. Go get all the data needed for that. And the repository knows because everything has been tagged. And so it reaches up and says, okay, this is all the data needed, and it goes to the VM and it loads up all the databases and transaction files, and it gets everything ready for the test. So this idea is that once I go migrate into this build and regression, that there's nothing manual to be done anymore. The repository takes care of that data lane. So this idea of complete automation of the test really revolves now around making sure that the data is available for the test. So So this idea, again, going back, this is kind of what we presented to our clients. We end up working with them to implement this process with them, and thinking about how test data should work in the DevOps world. So just to review, so a few things about this. The test data on demand, what we're talking about is test cases and test data are defined when the software feature is defined, right? So upfront in the sprint, when we define the software feature, we define the test data along with the cases that are defined, right? That we are able to easily find the data we need for testing or enhance data that's there or manufacture data in some limited cases. We do not want wholesale manufacturing of data because it just doesn't work in a complex environment. And then once we've tagged everything, we want to store it in our repository. We want to make sure the data doesn't get stale. We want to apply obfuscation policies because we don't want to expose sensitive data in a test environment, which is a big no-no in a lot of industries and should be in every industry, actually, given the environment we're living in right now with regulatory concerns. And then all data for testing applications are automatically loaded into. So just by having and using this process, we basically can hit all the points that we need to for test data on demand. So Don Kiernan is going to run through kind of a business case of test data management because, you know, everything should be pinned on a business case, right? We shouldn't just go out and buy cool things or change something just because. So why don't we just talk a little bit about doing it this way? What does that mean for us?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So what we found is that by investing in a test data management solution, it's not unrealistic to expect savings in the realm of 25 to 30%, which would have a major impact on the overall IT budget if we're saving significantly in QA and testing. So where do those savings come from? So first off, infrastructure savings. Many companies test with production data, and it's not unusual to find companies that have replicated their production environments 3, 4, or 10 times. And what that means is that infrastructure costs are then 3 or 4 or 10 times the production costs. With a test data management tool that has a powerful subsetting engine, you can create referentially intact subsets of the data that are a fraction of the size of the production data. So this will dramatically decrease the overall footprint of the lower environment and the resources that are needed to support them. So another area of benefit is the tester productivity. So improving tester productivity can also have a very substantial impact. As we saw before, testers can spend up to 60% of their time on doing non-testing activities, and that's dealing with the data. A good test data management system can reduce this time by allowing for accelerated test cycles, more test cycles, and fewer resources needed for testing. The third area is reducing support and rework costs. Your production support costs either increase or decrease based on the quality of the application. So by improving the quality of the application that goes into production, you can expect fewer defects, which will reduce remediation, reduce retesting, and reduce redeployments. So these are some of the hard savings. There's also some additional savings from cost avoidance, such as by preventing or dealing with a data breach before it would happen. So if we reduce the risk of a data breach, then as everyone knows, there's a very substantial costs that come along with that. Then we can do this by de-identifying the data, which, as we found, a lot of the companies we talked to have not yet taken to. De-identifying the data significantly reduces that risk and consequently reduces the cost. So as you can see, the business benefits of investing in a test data management solution are substantial. If anybody's interested, we have a vendor-neutral business case for test data management report that we'll be happy to send out, and we'll provide contact information at the end of the presentation. So let me just summarize a few of the key points from today's discussion. Faster delivery of high-quality software is a business imperative that's driven changes in how we develop and test new releases. But there's still challenges. To go faster, we've gotten pretty good at adopting Agile development principles and automating infrastructure provisioning. But now it's time for the data lanes to be brought up to speed and shifted to the left by getting the right data to the right place when it needs to be there. Using a test data management system like the one we described to eliminate bottlenecks by making data easy to find, manage, and use will enable self-service and end-to-end automation. And making sure that sensitive data is properly obfuscated will preserve privacy and ensure compliance with regulations to allow data to be shared freely without risk of exposure. So all this results in cost savings, shorter release cycles, less risk, and higher quality deliverables. So before we go to questions and answers, I'd like to just share with you a little bit of information about Semele Data. Semele provides innovative solutions for test data discovery, subsetting, and obfuscation for continuous testing and delivery. Our exclusive focus is on accelerating development velocity while maintaining sensitive data privacy. The roots of our company go back for over 20 years in the data management, data management domain for complex organizations that have large amounts of data. Our expertise is in working in these environments to bring efficiency, increase productivity, less risk, and overall IT costs through improvements in test quality, testing and quality assurance. So if this is an area of focus for your company, please feel free to contact us. We'll be happy to discuss any questions or challenges that you might have. So now we'll go to questions and answers.
All right, great. We have gotten a lot of questions in so far, so that's really great, but we have plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. First question here, would you suggest to use both approaches for test data management and choose an approach depending on the different types of testing? So example, E2E testing based on prod copy, system testing based on manufactured data.
Yeah, that's a great question because you know, it's never one or the other, right? It's usually some combination of both. And so, for instance, if you have just brand new things you're building, you have to manufacture data. You have no choice. There's nothing in production that meets that in some cases, or you can't find something to shape it. But the flip side of it is that, you know, for generally speaking, you want to try to use as much complexity out of your production system as possible. So there are definitely different cases where you manufacture data, some of you use production. The vast majority of the stuff should probably be data coming from your environments, because the things you don't see in manufactured data tend to be things like null cases, or, you know, that invalid data, a bad date, you know, and all those things have to be dealt with, right, in production. So that's why we tend to favor the vast majority coming from production, but we also need to manufacture at times. So good question.
Okay, all right, the next question here. One of the main pain points of using an automated solution to create test data from production data is the need to have integrity in the data and to exactly know all of the tables and relations. Does your solution help in any way with that precondition?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we talked about this idea of having a subsetting engine that could go find the main data and all the related data, right, that goes along with it. And the reason we built that the first time was because it's very difficult for really complex databases to write queries that can subset that data properly, as the person who's asking the question knows well. So what we do is we actually read the database catalog and rip through all of the relationships that have been defined across the database, so we can generate the proper queries. If it's a file-based system or the database catalog doesn't have the relationships in them, you would have to tell us what they are. You'd say, hey, there's a foreign key relationship here, or this data is the same as this data in this other file, and we would keep track of those relationships. So the good news is that you only have to give us that information one time, not every time you're trying to subset data. And then the system would, in fact, go through and do that. So yes, it does find all the related data and gives you a referentially intact subset.
Okay, all right, great. Next question here. What is the best strategy for data which is constantly changing the status based on upstream and downstream applications?
So what you have is different states are going on, right? So things are changing because an upstream does something or a downstream needs something. So what you have to do is define test cases that meet each one of those states, right? That the upstream could have choices A, B, and C, and if it chooses A, here are the 3 choices for me, and then when I make those 3 choices, there's 5 choices for the downstream, right? And what goes on. So, you know, that comes down to defining the test cases properly, and then making sure that I have the data that meets each one of those test cases. And that's what's really cool about being able to use a subsetting engine where I can give a data criteria. I can say that go out and find me every example of where there's an A, and then you can also define to it, hey, if system upstream as case A, I want 1, 2, and 3 for my system to be found inside my production system. So the idea is to get all the test cases right, get all the data permutations that you need, and load that to the test data repository, and then run through all of them, right, during your test, right? That's the point of the regression, is to test every possibility.
All right, excellent. Plenty of time for questions, guys, so feel free to use that GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. Our next one here, can you give a real-life example of how do we manage test data? For example, let's say we are trying to access a product type in a retail space and then go ahead and place an order. How does it flow from a test management perspective?
Yeah, so you have 2 kinds of testing that goes on, right? Testing that's private to a particular system, and testing that's integrated across an entire environment. So if you go from, for instance, you might have a inventory system that you're testing with stuff that came from somewhere else and goes to somewhere else. And if you lock down on it, you want test cases that are built simply for that inventory system along with the test data that go along. So you assume that the inventory system has inventory and that it's going to deplete inventory or whatever. But if you are looking at an integrated test across the whole environment, and you want to go from order entry to the sale to the depleting the inventory to delivery and the fulfillment on the back end, and then the route back around to accounting, that's a pretty long value chain that you're following. And in that case, if you're going to test the whole thing, then we want to be able to go out to the entire system and say, I'm testing my end-to-end process, and go find me data across all the systems because I would have defined the relationships. I would say this system is related to this other system through these fields of data, right? So order entry sends me product information, inventory depletes it based on a product, and it sends it to fulfillment, right? And that goes on. So if you define the relationships of the data across the entire value chain, and then you say to this application, hey, I'm testing all of this, all these systems in line, go find me the related data across it. It should be able to go do that. An example in the banking world, which we just dealt with, was online banking, right? Online banking is an integration across all the bank systems, right? We have to be able to so if I'm testing online banking, I have to put about 20 or 30 systems in the right state in the back end to be able to test it. I have to have the checking account system working, and which is demand deposits and the time deposits and things like that. So in the example, to send down tests, you need to define the relationships across these systems from a data perspective, and then expect the data management system, the test data management system, to go find data that meets that criteria. And that is what Semele does in a complex environment.
All right, excellent. Okay, next question. What are the main differences and advantages of your solution against other solutions, such as IBM InfoSphere test data management?
Yeah, and we don't actually do a lot of work like analyzing our competitors, because mostly if we're spending time worried about what they're doing, we're not focused on what we should be doing for our clients. But having said that, I think a lot of the stuff that's out there is kind of old-time test data management, like go get me a bunch of data and then turn around and obfuscate the data if we do that, and then put it someplace like a database and start testing. In the DevOps world, that is not how it works. It used to be a time, in fact, there was a version of Semele that says, oh, go get data from this production system and put it over that test system and get me ready for testing. In DevOps, it's different, right? Because I want data criteria to meet my test cases, and I want to manage it in a test data repository, tagging it, and then I want to use complete automation, REST calls, to move data into the repository and out of it, and all that kind of stuff to the systems that are being tested. So I think I don't really know of another solution that's out there that's really dealing with data for test data on demand for DevOps, and this idea of managing data based on test cases and the systems downstream. So.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, next question then. Let's see, in your experience with a customer such as a big financial institution, how long does it take to start using your solution?
Yeah, so that's the cool thing about something like approaching the problem from the direction we've come, is that you could actually start off with a single system, right? That let me go start dealing with that. And that's what I was saying, there's private testing to a system and there's integration testing across it. So if you've got a fairly large environment with a lot of applications and databases, you start off with solving the problem for a single system, right? And then you solve the problem for the system upstream to it and the system next to it and the system before it. So over time, you're building up this idea of I've got test data across all of these things. I've defined these systems to the application. And then, at some point, you get to a point that you get a critical mass. And how fast you get there, that's entirely up to you, how much resources you want to throw into it and how important it is for you to get to that. But I can tell you that you could be up and running in 3 days, right, with this. Install the software, go find some cases, and start building this thing to move forward. Yeah, it doesn't take that long to get going.
Excellent. All right. Great. Okay, so plenty of time for questions. We've gotten some really great ones in, but if you've got a question, please send it on in. Next question, does TDM include downstream transactional data cleanup?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. But TDM's responsibility is not to clean up the data in production. But part of what TDM should do is find those anomalies, right? You want it to select based on data criteria so there's no bias in the way it goes out and gets data. So you don't always pick accounts that are clean. You pick accounts that have problems because your application needs to be able to deal with them because it will deal with them when it gets to production, right? You're going to have that issue. So data cleanup is a completely different area of technologies that probably needs to be constant, right? Depending on the institution you're in or company. But it's not, strictly speaking, it's not test data management's responsibility for data cleanup. Now, finding all the right cases, that includes dirty data and data anomalies and things like that, that is part of the TDM responsibility.
All right, let's see, our next question, how does TDM support parallel and or containerized executions?
Yep, another good question. So that's the whole idea behind a repository. The repository has the data, the test data. The test data is tagged to test cases, and it's also tagged to systems, right? And so from the repository's perspective, it doesn't care how many downstreams, how many tests are going on in parallel, how many systems are involved. It just knows that I have data for whatever. So when you do a REST call to the repository and say, hey, give me the data for these 5,000 cases. Oh, by the way, here's the machine I want you to load the data to because all the databases have been instantiated there. It goes and does it. You could also say, so, think about testing in a DevOps world. Every tester, every developer should have their own VM. They should have their own VM with an entire universe of applications inside there that needs to be integrated and tested. So when I migrate my changes for my application in, all the other applications that integrate with it should be there in the right state. And then I run my test. And I should have a VM for every single developer or tester out there with their test cases and their test data loaded. And so from our perspective, going in, when you go to this extreme world where, we have as much parallel testing going on, that we can test on demand, that we migrate applications multiple times a day or every couple of days or whatever it is that we choose to do, or every few weeks, that we don't really care, right? So we're managing all of that because to us, we know what data belongs to what test, and you just tell us where you're running that test, and we'll take care of everything else as far as the data is involved. And that's kind of an interesting question too. So whoever asked it, if you guys want to reach out to us at info, we can have a few more conversations about what that means.
Excellent. Okay, great. All right. So next question: how do you think about data obfuscation? It's easy for me to say in complex data environments.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. The one thing that people always talk about, they tend to use live data and testing in a complex, highly integrated data environment. And the reason I do that is they say, well, if I change Bill Smith over here to Bob Jones, well, Bill Smith appears in like 15 databases out there, and I got to find how do I do that consistently? Or or his, you know, if I start shifting dates, how do I make sure the date stays synced? So let's say I have a transaction date and I change the transaction date because somehow that's important or whatever. How do I make sure I don't change it to where before the account was actually created, right? So when we first started this set of systems, I mean, that was one of the issues that we put together was an obfuscation engine that can go across that entire environment. So every time we see Bob Jones, he gets obfuscated to the right name. So it doesn't matter how many times I saw him, he's going to get changed to the right thing. And then, you know, manage dates the right way and all that kind of stuff. So it's not, people love saying it's too hard to do. It will cost too much money. That's really not true. There's actually really good technology that can go across these environments and do data discovery and figure out where all that data is located and the relationships inside of it, and then apply obfuscation policies to it. So.
Oh, okay. So the next question, you may have actually just answered it, but I want to go ahead and ask it anyway, just to be sure. How is the test data in your solutions repository kept up to date when database changes are applied over time?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. So what you would do is if there's a minor change, let's say there's an addition of columns or tables to a solution, then that would be just let's manufacture something and import it into the repository to take care of that case. But if there's a massive change to the database, and we need to go back and revalidate all the test cases. So basically, at that point, if there's a really big change to the application itself that is pretty massive, you'd probably want to go back and take all the test cases, which we have tagged to the system, and tell Semele to go out and go find new data in that format and bring it back to you. And that's an automated process. The repository can actually refresh all of its data for every test case it's got.
Excellent. Okay. All right, let's see. Next question is, if data is obfuscated, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question, because sometimes we use the terms masking and obfuscation and de-identification. We use them all, and sometimes we mean different things, and sometimes we actually mean the same thing. So properly obfuscated data should look like real data, because when you have like names or something, have a bunch of X's in it, or partial whatever, stars on stuff, it makes it really hard for a tester to actually figure out what that data is. And so we believe obfuscation is really putting a fake name in, putting a fake Social Security number. For example, the Social Security Administration has said that they will not assign numbers, Social Security numbers start with 666. So if you need to generate Social Security numbers, generate them in that range, right? Start them with 666. I know it's a weird number to some people, but you get my point. Like, you should create stuff that looks real, you know, and it's not. But here's what the reason is: you really want test data to be recognizable, right? You want testers to get really good at knowing their test data. And that's kind of a big problem with loading down production and changing data constantly, is because nobody knows the data. And so if there's some anomaly that they see in the application when they run the test, well, was it the test data was a problem, or was it the application that was a problem? We don't know. We have to go investigate, right? And so now, if you get to where we have a constant set of data, it looks real, I get to know. Now I know Bob Jones's account, and it has certain criteria that so when I see a report and all of a sudden he's showing up somewhere else in the report, I say, hey, there's a problem with your application because Bob Jones should not be here, you know, in this grouping of products or whatever. And so the point is, like, we want data to look real but be fake, and then we want the data to be slowly changing. We want test data to be slowly changing.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, next question. What if the data that you need is not in your production environment?
Yeah, so that's the case where you would have to manufacture something. So there's a couple ways to go about that. So you can just create data in a worksheet and then upload into a repository with all of the proper identifiers, so tag it to everything else, and we'll take care of the tagging to the case. But meaning that if you're using a customer account or something, having the proper account on the data you upload, we can apply obfuscation to it when you bring it, or we can just take the data you have and put it up there. There are times though where the data is on the proper process, and so there needs to be some work to go out and shape the data to where you need it and put it into a repository. And you know, at the end of the day, there's no magic, right? You just have to be able to create data. But the idea is to make that the 10% and the 90% being the data you can find, you know, and just port over directly. So.
All right, great. So we're about 9 minutes to the top of the hour. I think we have time for maybe 3 more questions. So the next one here is, what are the performance implications of using this system?
Yep, so that's a really great question. So because we're actually reducing the amount of data that has to be processed. So let's talk about it. The get data piece, where we have to go out to production and get find data, for instance. People are like, oh, you're going to affect my production system. But we're not grabbing massive, we're not telling the production system, send us 5,000 customers, right? We're saying, send me a customer that meets this criteria. So it's actually a fairly quick query that the subsetting engine generates and goes and pulls the data back. But if there's a problem with that, you know, you can also run it at off-peak times, or you can run it against a replicated copy of the database, production database, or whatever. So there's very little performance hit. And because we're only creating data needed for the test case, we actually shrink the test environment down. It's not all of production. It's not this massive amount of data anymore. It's only the 5,000 or 10,000 or 30,000 customers or 100,000 customers that you need to actually run your test. If you're doing a volume production, you know, kind of performance test, that's a different animal. We all get that, right? You got to generate enough volume to do it. We're talking about the functional test. It needs to be 5, 10, 20,000 customers and accounts should be plenty. So when you think about it, I could be able to turn cycles very, very fast if I've got a small amount of data, and I can rip through test cycles in no time flat, right? Which actually gives me better throughput across the entire system. So managing your test data to the test cases, to the applications, it actually makes the testing time go way down and performance increases.
Okay. All right. Next question. Can you automate via REST API?
Yes, and we haven't end completely yet. In fact, that's our next release is coming out. But when you tell the test data repository, I'm running these 5,000 cases, that is a REST call. You send in the call from whatever the system is, and then you tell it what the target is. Where is the virtual machine located? What are the credentials I need to be able to access the virtual machine in the REST call? And the test data repository takes care of attaching to it, logging in, loading all the data, getting everything prepared for it. So what we want to do is end-to-end. So you can actually start with a REST call that says, go find me data, obfuscate data if I need to, you know, load it to a repository, and then send it out to the target system, right, in a microservices kind of call. And we can do it all end-to-end, and that's probably the next release we're going to put out around it. But the idea of getting data from the repository to the target databases is a REST call.
Okay. All right, great. All right, let's do one more question, then we'll close it out. Writing queries can be complex. So what kind of skills do you need to operate this system?
Yep, that's a really good question. So when we started building it, that was the idea behind the subsetting engine, is that, you know, writing queries is complex. If you're an analyst or a tester and you're not used to writing fairly complex queries against, you know, 500 table or 1,000 table databases, or even some less numerous tables, but complex data anyway, it can be daunting. And even for developers, it can be daunting at times to write enough queries and adjust them rapidly. The subsetting engine does the work. So you just give it a filter criteria. I need 5,000 customers that have this kind of account that's had this transaction in the last 30 days. That's the data I need. Go find it. And so when you give it a filter criteria, it looks at the database catalog, it looks at the relationships you define to it, and it generates both queries and processing logic that it needs to go find and get the data it needs and bring it back. And so you actually need, when you're doing the testing side of this, less skills than you would need in the old way of doing testing.
All right, great. Well, we are about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and close out the question and answer period. Thank you to everybody who did submit a question. We had so many great questions, so gosh, lots and lots of good stuff. I do want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the ability to do that. We will be sending out that email later that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And while you're there, please take a look at the other webinars that we have, both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be one or two at least that pique your interest. Chris, Don, thank you very much for a great presentation and lots of good stuff. And like I said, judging from the quality of the questions we got, I'm sure the audience got a lot out of it. So thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much.
All right, great. And I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody.